The butter churned she turned, till her shoulders bled. A Lakota chief set her down in the grass. I heard it before I saw her. That sound, the thud of a churn handle, worked in short, too fast strokes, over and over, before the sun had even cleared the cottonwoods along the creek. I'd camped 2 nights on the west bank, maybe a quarter-mile upstream from her place, scouting crossings, counting where the ground would hold under cattle come fall, doing the kind of work that used to take a week and now took 3 because half the crossings were either disputed or had been circled on a new agency map. I wasn't sleeping. Hadn't been sleeping through a night in 2 winters by then. Too much weight behind my eyes when the dark came down. So in that gray beforelight I lay on my blanket and listened to that sound carrying across the water, and my first thought wasn't about a woman. I didn't know it was a woman yet. My first thought was, whoever that is, they're working it wrong. You work a churn in long, steady strokes. Let the cream find its own time. Wrestle it like you're angry at it, and all you'll get is sore arms and thin butter by noon. I didn't go that first morning. I had crossings to check and a meeting with the agency man Thursday, and I put the sound out of my mind. But I heard it the second morning, same rhythm, same short, angry stroke. And the third. By the third morning I'd moved my camp downstream and shouldn't have been close enough to hear anything at all. But those early mornings out there had a particular quiet to them. No wind, no birds yet, just the sky going from black to bruised purple to that pale nothing color before the light decides, and the sound carried. On the 4th morning I rode over. The claim sat east of the creek, 50 yards back from the bank. A soddy with a wood frame addition tacked to the south side. Somebody had started to build better and then run out of money or will or time, hard to say which. A garden running east from the soddy that was doing better than it had any right to, given how dry the summer had been. That told me something. A milk cow in a cottonwood pole pen, looking at me with the peaceful, empty expression cows always wear, like the world is a thing that happens around them, and they've made their peace with not understanding it. And at the south side of the soddy, working an old cracked churn with her back to me, was a woman. She was maybe 35. Hard to say with certainty. The country out here does different things to different people, and some women age fast and some don't. She had light brown hair pulled back hard at her neck, and her sleeves were rolled past her elbows already, and she was going at that churn in the short, tight strokes I'd been hearing from across the water. She didn't hear me ride up. The cow looked at me. The woman kept working. I said in English, "Good morning." She spun fast, and her right hand went straight to the wall of the soddy without looking, toward something hanging there. A rifle, I found out later. Her hand knew exactly where it was. I opened my palms where she could see them and kept the horse still. She looked at me, not scared, taking me apart from the ground up, the careful measuring look of someone deciding what category to put you in before she uses another word. After a moment she said, "I know who you are." I said I doubted that. She said, "You're the one they call Red Jack at the agency. You were at the boundary meeting in the spring." I had been at that meeting. Been there when the new agent unrolled his map and showed my people where their land now ended, and the difference between what the new map said and what the old map had said was about 12,000 acres of good grass and 3 water crossings that had been ours since before any man in that room was born. I'd said things at that meeting that the agent hadn't enjoyed hearing. Apparently the word had traveled. She told me who she was, Nora Aldis. Her husband had filed the claim 4 years back and died of fever 2 winters in. She'd stayed. She said it the way you'd say the creek runs north. A fact about the ground. No asking me to understand it, no flinching from it, no softening. He died and I stayed. Plain as that. I said I'd heard her churn from across the water. Something moved across her face. Not quite embarrassment, more like the mild annoyance of someone who doesn't like there being anything that needs explaining. I said I'd grown up helping my mother at the churn, that you had to go slow, long strokes. She said she knew how to churn cream. I said if that was true, Her butter would still be liquid by noon. Silence. She looked at the churn, then back at me. I don't know exactly what made me do the next thing. I got down off my horse, walked over and took the handle. Showed her. Long, easy strokes, the weight of your whole arm behind it, not just your wrist, and breathe between so the plunger finds its rhythm. The old churn was cracked and had been repaired with 2 wraps of wire near the bottom, and the handle had some play in it that worked against you if you rushed. But if you went slow, you could work around it. She watched me for a minute, then held out her hand and I gave it back. Her next 3 strokes were different. Her shoulders came down a fraction, something around her jaw unclenched. She didn't thank me. I didn't wait for it. I got back on my horse and I left. I told myself, riding back, that I wouldn't go out there again. I had enough to manage without adding a settler widow to the list of things I was responsible for thinking about. I went back 2 weeks later. I had business with a rancher named Garvey on the flat east of her place. A dispute over whether his fence line had crept 200 yards west in the spring thaw, which it had, and her trail was on the way. I told myself that going out, and I almost believed it coming back. She was weeding the garden when I rode up, on her knees in the afternoon heat, which is the wrong time to weed. You want the morning, when the ground is still a little damp and the roots give easier. I didn't say anything about that. I said I'd found coyote tracks in the creek mud 2 mornings back. Big male, young female running with him. I figured they were denned in the cutbank east of her ridge. She looked up from the garden and shaded her eyes. Said news traveled fast for a man who lived in a camp. I said I was going to show her how to set snares. That pause she had, the measuring one. Then she put down what she was holding, got up and came with me. We spent the better part of that afternoon at the cutbank. I showed her the placement, the angle, the part about covering your scent that most people skip because it seems like extra work for something that might not matter, but it does matter. It's often the difference. She watched the first one once, then did the second herself, and she did it right. Her hands were sure. She didn't talk while she was working, which I noticed. Most people fill silence when they're learning something, talk to keep from having to think too hard. She was quiet, and her hands went where they needed to go, and she thought. Walking back in the long afternoon light, she told me she'd grown up on a farm in Ohio. Said her father had trapped. She said, I knew the principles. I just hadn't been shown how they work out here. She understood the difference between knowing a thing from instruction and knowing it from the country itself, and most people take a long time to arrive at that distinction. She put coffee on when we got back, and we sat at her outdoor table, 2 flat planks across sawhorses, nothing fancy, and drank it in the gold evening light with the creek sound coming up as the air cooled. Meadowlarks in the grass settling in for the night. A quiet that had something in it rather than nothing. She said after a while, the men at the agency said you were dangerous. I said they were right. Something shifted in her face, not toward fear, away from it, which is a different direction. I said I'm dangerous the same way a winter creek is dangerous. You know where it runs, you stay out of its way, you'll be fine. She thought about that, poured more coffee from the pot without asking if I wanted it, which I noted. She said, what are you really doing out here? The crossing's Garvey's fence. I said land was changing hands faster than it should, and my people needed someone willing to stand in the way of it when it was worth standing. She looked at me and nodded, the nod of someone who's heard a true thing and is filing it right, not offering sympathy, just receiving it accurately. I appreciated that more than sympathy. I left when the light went. Told myself going home that was enough. I'd seen she was managing, and that was the extent of it. I was back 6 weeks later, and then again. By the time fall settled in, I'd been out to her place 4 or 5 times, each with a reason I could name. The overflow ditch that had silted up and was running wrong, I showed her how to clear it. A fence post on the south line that had heaved in the spring frost and was leaning enough to eventually fail. I set it right while she handed me what I needed without being asked. a problem with the cow's back foot that she'd already caught and started treating correctly, which again told me she was paying attention to the things in her care. She always had coffee and she always set food in front of me without asking first, which is a thing you notice about a person, that they feed you without requiring you to say you need it. She talked precisely, no more words than the thing required, and she had opinions she said plainly, and she didn't ask you to agree. She asked one question at a time and waited for the full answer before she asked the next. You don't often meet people who know how to listen that way. I asked her once, in September, if she was lonely. She was quiet, looking out at the creek. Then she said, "Lonely is what happens when you thought you were going to get something and didn't get it. I stopped expecting things a while back. So no, just alone." I turned that over for a long time after. There's a particular hard wisdom in it that most people don't arrive at until they've been ground down far enough to earn it. Stopping the expecting without stopping the living. That takes more strength than most people know they're showing when they do it. My own life by then was a long exercise in the gap between expecting and having. I'd been a man of real standing once, in a world that had its own order and dignity and sense. That world had been remade past recognition in my lifetime, and I'd spent 20 years trying to preserve whatever piece of it I could hold. I had maybe 40 people who still looked to me for something, older men and women, a few families with children young enough to still be uncertain about things. The younger men had gone two ways, some to the agency, taking what the government offered and right to be angry about it, some onto the cattle spreads as hands, which was survival but which was also a kind of slow disappearing. I was trying to hold something together that kept coming apart, and doing it without the things that had made the holding possible when I was younger. The old consensus, the unity of purpose, the sense that the path ahead was hard but had a shape to it. I was 60-some years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that sits behind everything else and doesn't lift when you lie down. I didn't tell Nora any of that, not that fall. But she watched me the way she watched her garden, attentive to what was actually in front of her, not what she'd expected to see, and I think she saw more than I was saying. The first winter I knew her was hard. Not the hardest I'd lived through. I'd seen winters in my youth that buried tippies to the smoke hole and killed cattle by the hundreds, and turned the air so cold it hurt to breathe through your nose, but hard enough. Snow came in November and didn't leave until March, and the cold got into things and made itself permanent. I got out to her place twice that winter. The first time was in December, making sure she was managing, and she was deliberate and steady, eating through her stores in a way that showed she'd planned it out in advance, nothing left to chance. The second time was in late January, after 10 days of storm that had everyone pinned down, and when I rode up and saw the way she was holding her right hand against her side, I knew before she said a word. She tried to pull a frozen gate open in the worst of the cold, and the iron handle had taken skin off 2 fingers and the heel of her palm. She'd wrapped it herself, tight and clean. She knew what she was doing, I'll give her that. But the wrapping had been on too long and infection was starting at the edges, the specific angry red that means something is happening under the skin that needs to be stopped before it goes further. I sat her at the table. I had yarrow in my saddlebag, which I've carried since I was a young man. It was the first thing my mother taught me to find and use. And I had a drawing root she'd also shown me, good for pulling heat out of infected flesh. I made a small fire in her stove and heated water and cleaned the wound the right way, and then I made the poultice and laid it on and wrapped the hand fresh with the clean cloth I always carry. She sat very still while I worked. She was watching my hands. When I was done, she said quietly, "Where did you learn that?" I said, "From my mother." She said she must have been a good woman. I said she was the best woman I ever knew. I said it plain, without thinking first, the way you say something that's been true your whole life when someone finally asks. Saying it in that small, warm room in January, with the snow piling against the window glass, and the fire going and the smell of the yarrow in the air felt like opening a door in myself that I'd been keeping shut because there was no one to open it for. Nora looked at her wrapped hand for a moment. She said, "I want to say something to you." I waited. She said, "You know there are men in this county who would not be happy knowing you come out here." I said I knew. She said, "Does that bother you?" I said, "Not particularly." She was still looking at her hand, not at me, and she said, "It doesn't bother me either. Quiet and even, just letting it be in the room between us." It landed the way she meant it to. I stayed that night. There was a storage room off the back of the soddy, small, with dried goods stacked along the wall, and I slept on the floor with my saddle blanket under me. In the morning the porridge and coffee were ready before I was up, which meant she'd been up earlier, which meant she'd thought about it the night before. We ate without talking much. I checked her hand before I left, the red already pulling back at the edges, which was what the yarrow does when you catch it early enough, and I rode out into the cold and thought about a woman who would say, "It doesn't bother me either," in 1881 in a county that had opinions about such arrangements. Thought about what it cost her and whether she'd weighed it, and whether she knew what that kind of straight, quiet courage was worth. I was still thinking about it when I got back to camp. Spring came and the creek went up, and then things changed. The new regulations from the agency came in March, on official paper with a seal. Any Lakota man found more than 5 miles from his registered camp without a travel pass from the agent was subject to return or detainment. 5 miles. My people needed to move to find game, to trade, to keep anything going that resembled the life we were supposed to be able to live. And now there was a paper required for every step beyond 5 miles, obtainable from a man who sat in an office 12 miles east and wasn't always there when you made the ride. I spent March and April dealing with it, arguing with the new agent, a young man, convinced of himself, the type who'd read about the territory from back east and arrived certain he understood it, which is the most dangerous kind of certainty there is. Negotiating the passages through the regulations that would let people move when they genuinely had to. And holding the lid down on the anger in camp, which was the right anger, the earned anger of men being handled like animals on a leash, and which I had to keep contained anyway, because if it spilled the price would fall on my people and not on the men who'd made the rules. That's how it always worked. The price always fell on us. I was getting old for it. Not in body, I was still strong and could still work as hard as I'd worked at 30, but old in that other way. 60-some years of having to prove your humanity to people who decided the answer before they looked at you, having to prove it again the next day and the next. There's a particular weight to that, a specific kind of wearing down, and it doesn't ease when you sleep, and it doesn't lift when the season turns. You just carry it and keep carrying it. I didn't get out to Nora's place for 2 months. When I came back in May, she was in the garden, which had gotten bigger, and there were 2 more cows in a pen that had also gotten bigger. She looked up when I came around the side of the soddy, and she didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me. She'd gotten a contract, she explained. The hotel in the settlement wanted butter and cheese on a weekly delivery. She'd taken it, and she was expanding to meet it. I looked at what she'd added, the extra cows, the larger pen, the extension to the cheese-making area. More milking before first light, more churning, more of everything that already filled every hour she had. I said, "You need help." She said she'd had help. A boy from the settlement who came out Tuesdays and Thursdays, a good steady worker. He'd left last month, some family matter that took him east. I could see it on her. She wasn't the kind to complain about being tired, and she wouldn't. But you can see it in how a person stands when they've been running on will instead of rest for a while. A held upright quality, like something invisible is pressing down, and they're bracing against it constantly. And they've gotten so good at bracing they don't notice anymore how much of their strength is going just to that. I spent 2 days. fixed the overflow ditch that had silted back up over winter, rebuilt the weak corner of the cow pen, helped her set up a proper cheese rack that would drain the way it was supposed to instead of the improvised thing she'd been working around. She worked alongside me the whole time without getting in the way and without waiting to be told what to do next. The alongside skill, the ability to work with someone rather than at them or after them, is rarer than it should be, and she had it clean and natural. The second evening, sitting outside with the last of the light fading, she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "I thought the hardest thing would be deciding to stay after Chet died. I thought if I could make that decision once and mean it, the rest would be downhill. But it's not one decision. It's the same decision every morning, and some mornings it weighs more than others." I looked out at the creek. I said it was the same for me with my people. That holding something together isn't a thing you do once and walk away from. You do it every day, and some days what you're holding it together with is your hands, and some days it's just your teeth and the particular stubbornness that comes from having done it this long. She turned to look at me, not the measuring look from the beginning which had always had a door in it. The door was open now. She'd walked through it a while back and we both knew it. She said, "You must get very tired." Nobody had said that to me in I couldn't count how long. My people needed my strength. The agency needed my resistance. There was no one to say it to and no point saying it, and I'd gotten so used to that being true that hearing it said, plainly, by a woman who'd been watching closely enough to see it, did something I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know what to do with it. So I looked at the creek and I didn't say anything and she didn't push it, and we sat until the stars came in one by one, and then I rode out. That summer was the longest I'd been away from her place. The confrontation at the southern crossing went worse than it needed to. 2 young men from our camp, agency police who'd come looking for them, a rifle butt across one man's face when he didn't move fast enough, and a crowd of other young men behind him who had every right to what they were feeling, and who I spent 2 weeks talking down because if they didn't pull back, the cost would land on everyone around them and not on the man who'd swung the rifle. I was angry too. I had been angry since March in a way I'd learned to keep internal, which is its own kind of weight. But I held the lid and I kept talking and the situation didn't explode, and not exploding was the best outcome available, and I had to act like that was enough. 6 weeks. I was out at the southern end of what was left of our range, and then I was negotiating with the agent again, and then there was a matter of a sick elder who needed things I had to go and find, and 6 weeks went by and I didn't get to her place. When I finally went, in late August, I went the long way around. The short route had gone to dispute over the summer, and I didn't need that added to the morning. I heard the churn before I was in sight of the place. I heard it and I pulled my horse up because the sound was the same as the first morning, 4 summers ago. Short, angry, too fast. That particular sound of a person who stopped working at something and started fighting it instead. Something tightened in my chest. I came around the south side of the soddy, and there she was. She'd been at it long enough that her whole body had given up on her. Her posture, which was usually upright and certain, had collapsed forward, all her weight thrown into her arms because her back had stopped helping a while ago. Her sleeves pushed past her elbows, her hands on the handle, and there was blood on the wood. Not a lot, but it was there, dark against the old pale churn handle. The skin on her right palm and the back of her wrist was open in 2 or 3 places, the kind of opening that happens when skin's been rubbed raw past the first pain and the person holding the thing didn't stop. Dried in the creases, freshly reopened. She'd been at it a good while. The butter was probably done. It had probably been done for 20 minutes. She was past knowing that. She was past most things. She was just working, and the working had become something else. A war she was having with the weight of it all. The hotel order due Friday, the 2 cows waiting at 4 in the morning, the 6 weeks of no hired help, the 40-some other things that had been pressing on her shoulders since May and that she'd been carrying without saying a word about to anyone, because there wasn't anyone to say them to. I got off my horse. I walked over to the Churn, and I put my hand over hers on the handle. She stopped. Her breath was ragged. She didn't turn around right away. Her shoulders were shaking a little, not from cold. I didn't say anything. I took the handle out from under her hands and set it against the soddy wall. Then I put my hands around her elbows gently, and I turned her to face me. She came with it, didn't fight it. Her face was sun-dark and her hair had come half loose from its pin, and there were tracks on her face that weren't all from sweat. She hadn't been crying, exactly, not the kind that means you've given yourself permission. She'd been leaking. The way a person does when they're past the point where holding it together is working, but they haven't decided to let go. I walked her 3 steps to where the grass grew long on the south side of the soddy, out of the sun, and I sat her down in it. Just that. Sat her down in the long grass, and she let me, and I crouched in front of her and I held her hands between mine and I looked at what she'd done to them. She said, "I'm all right." I said, "I know you are." She said, "The hotel orders due Friday." I said, "I know." I held her hands and we were both looking at them. The blood dried in the creases. The area around the open places freshly pink, which meant she'd reopened them more than once in the last hour. I got the cloth and the yarrow out of my bag, cleaned her palms and her wrist, slow, easy where it was sore, wrapped them firm enough to hold but not so tight it would pull. I kept my hands steady because that was what was needed right now. I worked without talking because there was nothing useful to say yet. When the wrapping was done, I didn't let go of her hands. She was looking down at them in mine. Her breath had come back to something close to normal. The shaking in her shoulders was gone. She said, soft, almost to herself, "I don't know why you keep coming back out here." I said, "I do." She looked up. I said, "Because you're worth coming back to." She was quiet. The long grass moved in a small wind. The creek went on making its sound, the way it does regardless of everything else. A meadowlark somewhere east late in the day for meadowlarks, but they'll sing in the afternoon when the air is right. She said, "You know what people say." I said I'd been hearing what people said about me for 60 years, and I was still here. She almost smiled. Then she let it come the whole way. The kind of smile that changes the whole face, that comes from somewhere real and doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. I'd seen maybe 3 of those in 4 years of knowing her, and each one had landed the same way, somewhere I didn't think of as a place anything could land. She said, "I'm a widow and you're," she stopped, looking for the word that fit without being wrong. I said, "A chief, or that's what they called me before they decided the word didn't mean what it used to." She said, "You're still a chief." I said, "Only out here." She looked past me at the grass and the creek and the big late summer sky. She said, "Out here is the only place that's real to me." I stayed that day. I finished the churning, went slow, long strokes, the way it has to go, and it was done in 20 minutes, and I packed the butter and she sat in the long grass with her wrapped hands in her lap and rested, which she didn't argue about. That not arguing told me more than most things had. Late in the afternoon, she came to stand beside me at the creek while I was washing up. She didn't say anything, just stood there, close enough that I could feel her presence without us touching, and she looked at the water with me. She had a way of standing, planted, something that didn't blow around. That was its own kind of steadiness. After a while she said, "My hands will heal." I said they would. She said, "What about you? You look like you've been carrying something heavy all summer, and you haven't put it down." I looked at the water. She turned and looked at me, not the trying to figure me out look. She'd done that years ago. This was the look of someone who's already understood and is making a decision about what to do with what they know. She said, "Put it down for tonight. There's nowhere you need to be. I put it down. Not all of it. No man puts it all down at once just because someone tells him to. But enough. Enough to eat the meal she made, venison she'd put up the fall before, biscuits, coffee strong enough to keep a man's eyes open until midnight without my mind pulling at the agency and the young men and the maps and what could be salvaged and what couldn't. Enough to sit outside after, in the cooling evening air, and let the stars come in one at a time and feel the quiet as a good weight. The weight of nothing more being required of you right now. She sat beside me on the bench along the soddy wall. Not close, not far. Our shoulders almost but not quite touching, and that almost had more presence than some things that are fully done. After a long time of easy silence, she said, "I want you to keep coming out here." I said I'd been doing that. She said more, a pause, "if you want to." I looked at the stars, the creek sound, an owl starting up in the cottonwoods, that low pulse before it commits to the full call. I said yes. She nodded, the kind of nod that isn't surprise, more like confirmation of something already decided. At some point her shoulders settled against mine, not announced, not made into anything. The way water finds a level, a gradual thing, and then it was there. I felt the weight of her beside me, and I let it be there, and I did not move. That was the beginning, and a beginning is not the same as what it becomes. I'll try to say what it became in the plainest terms I know. There are different ways a man gets known in a life. Some men get known for what they can do, for what they can build and endure and work through. Some men get known for what they are worth, which is a different thing and rarer, and it doesn't happen on its own. I had been the first kind my whole life, a man who could do things, a man whose people relied on him, a man the agency had to deal with even when they didn't want to deal with him. I'd done all of it and carried all of it, and I'd done it alone in the place that matters, alone in the sense that nobody looked at me and saw the whole man. They saw the chief, the obstacle, the problem to be managed, the representative of something they were trying to reduce. Nobody looked at me the way you look at a crossing when you're not in a hurry, not to decide what you're going to do about it, just to see what's actually there. Nora Aldis looked at me that way. She saw the man who knew where coyotes denned, and how to set a fence post, and how to work a cracked churn, and how to wrap a wound in January, and how to sit in the evening quiet without needing to fill it up. She saw the man who'd been carrying 20 years of a losing fight without letting it break his posture, who was tired in the way that doesn't show because you can't afford to let it show, who still got up every morning and did the work because the work needed doing. She saw all of that and she turned toward it. Freely. Not because she needed saving. She'd proven a long time ago she didn't need saving, and not out of pity. She turned toward it because she decided it was worth turning toward, and she kept making that decision, which is the only way any decision is real. There were people who said things. The men at the settlement had their opinion. Some of the older women in my camp had theirs. Pruitt, the sheep rancher to the north, stopped speaking to her, which was his right, and which I never heard her mention. A man named Hicks who ran cattle east of her place made a comment in the feed store that traveled back to me through 2 different mouths over the following week. What Nora Aldis did about Hicks's comment was to walk into that feed store on her next trip to town and stand in the middle of it, in front of whoever was at the counter and whoever else was there, and say that she'd made her choice. She'd make it again tomorrow, and the business of her life was hers to conduct and not a subject for anyone else's commentary. She said it without heat and without her voice shaking, and then she bought her flour and her salt and she left. I wasn't there. I heard it from 2 different people in the following days. One told it as a scandal. The other told it like a thing he'd been turning over since it happened and hadn't finished thinking about yet. When I heard it, something in my chest that had been hollow for a long time filled up a little. Not all the way, but enough that I could feel the difference. All the years of the agency and the boundary lines and the maps that kept moving and the men who looked at me and decided what I was before I'd finished a sentence, all of it still there, still mine to carry. But this too now. A woman who'd stood in the middle of a feed store in front of the whole county and said my choice and again tomorrow and none of your business, and said it for a Lakota man with 60-some years of weight on him, and hands that knew how to wrap a wound and work a churn and hold things together that kept trying to come apart. The old men in my people used to say, a man's worth isn't fully real until someone with nothing to gain from saying it says it out loud. I'd been waiting a long time to find out what that felt like. It turned out it felt like something hollow becoming solid, like ground under your feet you hadn't known wasn't there. The years after that I won't try to account for all of. There are too many of them and half of them belong to her to tell, not me. But I'll say the particular things. There was the winter, 2 years in, when I got sick, something in my chest that wouldn't clear for 6 weeks, worse than anything I'd had before, the kind of sick that makes a man wonder. She didn't talk about it the way some people would. She didn't make it into a thing she was suffering on my behalf. She just showed up every morning and did what needed doing and was there when I was awake enough to know she was there. And one evening in February when the fever had finally come down and I was sitting up for the first time in 4 days and the moonlight was coming in the window, she put her hand on the side of my face and she said, "Still here." Just that. 2 words. And the way she said them, not like she was telling me something, like she was telling herself something she'd been needing to say out loud, that was the second time I understood, really understood, what it meant to be chosen by this particular woman. There was a summer 3 years after the beginning when one of the young men in my camp, a good young man, a man I'd known since he was small, one of the ones who'd stayed, was in a dispute with a settler about water rights at a shared spring, and it went to the county, and the county sided with the settler, which was no surprise, and the young man was going to do something about it that would have cost him everything. I talked to him for 2 full days. I talked until I had nothing left that was worth saying. And it was Nora who found the third option, an arrangement she worked out with the settler's wife, who it turned out had her own thoughts about how the matter had been handled, and who was willing to negotiate something the men on both sides hadn't been able to find. She never mentioned it to me as a thing she'd done. I heard about it from the young man's mother. There was the morning, maybe 6 years in, when a newspaper man from back east came through the county and wanted to write something about the Indian situation for his paper, and he came out to talk to me, and he spent an hour asking me questions and taking notes. And when he left, Nora, who'd been in the garden and hadn't said a word during any of it, came and stood beside me and said, "He didn't hear half of what you told him." I said I knew. She said, "That's because he came out here already knowing what he wanted the article to say." I said that was right. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "The people who matter heard you." I didn't ask her what she meant. I knew what she meant. What I mean when I say she saw me is that. All of that. Not just the capable part that people needed. Not just the stubborn standing his ground part that the agency had to deal with. The whole man, the tired part, the hollow part, the part that had been carrying weight so long it no longer remembered what it felt like not to. She saw that part and she didn't look away from it and she didn't try to fix it or explain it. She just stood next to it. Every morning the same decision, the same turning toward. That is not a small thing, that is the whole thing. 13 years ago, near enough. 13 winters and 13 wet springs, and a few things I hadn't expected to improve that improved a little, and a lot of things that didn't and won't. The restrictions stayed tight for a few years, and then something shifted in how the agency was being run, and they loosened a degree. My people didn't get back what was taken. That's not the kind of thing that gets given back. But something survived that I'd spent years not being certain would survive, and some of the young men found their way back to the people, and I was there to see it, which is more than I'd counted on at some points. Nora's claim is a real ranch now. Lumber walls, a good floor. The addition that was tacked-on frame when I first knew her is now solid with proper insulation and a stove in it that draws right. She hired a girl from the settlement 3 years back who comes in 5 days a week. The hotel contract has expanded twice. She doesn't have to work herself to bleeding at the Churn anymore. She knows this and she doesn't. She'll say to me sometimes if she thinks I'm doing the male version of it, pushing past sense, working out of stubbornness when the need has already been met, she'll say it level and quiet. Put it down. 2 words. The same ones from the creek that August. And I do. Every time I do. I'm out on the south fence line this morning. Been riding it since early light, checking posts after the spring wet. A wet spring always heaves something. The grass is long today. After the right rain at the right time, the country remembers what it's supposed to look like. And it looks like this. Green all the way to the ridge. The creek running high and cold and clear after the snowmelt. Meadowlarks working 3 or 4 at a time in the long grass. Each one insisting on the boundaries of his own piece of it and not giving any ground. I'll be back at the soddy before the morning's too far gone. The coffee will be on, she always has it on, and she'll look up when I come through the door. And the look will be there. The same one she had in the long grass that August afternoon, with her hands wrapped in mine and the meadowlark singing late in the day and the weight finally set down for an hour. It's not a complicated look. It's a woman who sees you whole, the weight and the work and the years and the particular man underneath all of it, and turns toward that. Every morning. The same choice, freely made again. That is what I've been given. 60-some years on this ground, and I've seen a lot come and go and come back in shapes I didn't expect. I've held things together that wanted badly to fall apart. I've stood in front of men who needed me to be something smaller than I was. I've carried what needed carrying, and I've kept going when the going was done on spite alone, because that's what was left and it was enough. And I've got this too. A fence line to ride in long morning grass, a creek running right, meadowlarks doing their arguing against the sky, and a woman in a soddy a mile north who will look up when I come in. The coffee won't be cold yet. I'd better head back.